They told me to wait in the garage on Christmas Day. "It's warmer than it looks," they said, their voices polite but distant, as if I were a fragile object that might shatter if handled too closely. The cold bit through the thin blanket they gave me, the one that had seen better days, but was all they thought I deserved. Outside, the house buzzed with laughter and light, the scent of pine and cinnamon drifting through the cracked window. I could hear the clink of glasses, the murmur of conversation, and the sharp bursts of children's laughter echoing down the hall. But I was not part of any of it. I was out here, in the garage, a forgotten shadow at the edge of their celebration. I am 78 years old. For most of my life, I was the keeper of this family's traditions, the one who baked the pies, sewed the costumes, and stayed up late to wrap presents with trembling hands, humming carols softly as the world slept. But today, I was the invisible guest, the uninvited shadow crouched in the corner of their perfect Christmas. It was a day that should have been warm with love and belonging, yet here I was, wrapped in a threadbare throw, watching the cold seep through the cracks in the garage door. I knew the truth before they even said it, the way my son's eyes flicked away when I looked for a sign of welcome, the way his wife's smile never quite reached her eyes, the way the grandchildren barely glanced my way, their faces glued to glowing screens. These were the small betrayals that build into silence, the quiet acts that say, without words, "You do not belong here." They said it so casually, almost kindly, like it was a favor, a temporary measure. But I understood perfectly well what it meant. This was not a mistake. This was a message. I was a guest who had overstayed her welcome, a burden better left outside, where I could not spoil the perfect picture they wanted to show the world. I remembered the morning, the coldness of the driveway as I unloaded my bags, the way the snow crunched underfoot like broken promises. I wore my best sweater, the one my mother gave me years ago, faded but still soft. I had brought my own dishes, my own stories, hoping to be part of something I once called family. But the welcome was hollow, wrapped in smiles that never reached the eyes, gestures that were more about duty than desire. I was shown the way to the garage like a stray cat, offered a chair that rocked on uneven legs and a blanket too thin for the biting winter. They told me to stay put, to be patient, that I could join them soon. But the door closing behind me was a verdict louder than any shout. The cold was sharp, but the ache inside was sharper still. I sat there, watching the shadows dance on the cracked concrete, hearing the music swell through the thin walls and wondering when they would remember me, if they ever would. I thought about the years I had given them, the holidays filled with laughter and love, the birthdays celebrated with homemade cakes and hand-knitted scarves. I remembered how my hands used to shake with excitement when the grandchildren were small, how I carried them on my hip and sang lullabies until they drifted to sleep. And now I was nothing more than a forgotten relic, a piece of furniture to be moved aside when the spotlight shifted. But even in that cold garage, I felt a fire stir within me, a quiet rebellion that would not be extinguished by their neglect. They may have trapped me out here, but I was not broken. I was still here. I was still standing. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the cold and the silence, I began to plan my escape. The moment I realized this was no accident, no misunderstanding, no momentary lapse of kindness, was when I heard the door to the garage click shut behind me and the unmistakable sound of the lock turning. It was a sound so final, so deliberate, that it echoed in my mind long after the muffled laughter faded into the distance. They hadn't just left me outside. They had trapped me. It was Christmas, the day meant for togetherness, yet I sat alone, surrounded by boxes of forgotten holiday decorations and a spider-webbed corner that had not seen attention in years. The cold crept into my bones, settling deep where no blanket could reach, and with it came a realization heavier than the winter night. I was being cast aside, removed from the warmth not just of the house but of the family itself. Earlier that day, my son had exchanged a quick glance with his wife, an unspoken agreement that made my heart sink, though I tried to ignore it. They had led me through the house like a reluctant participant in a play where the script had been rewritten without my consent. The grandchildren barely glanced up from their screens, whispering among themselves as if my presence were a shadow to be ignored rather than a grandmother to be cherished. When they reached the kitchen, my daughter-in-law said in a tone that was too light to carry such cruelty, "Mom, there's just not enough room inside. The kids need their space and the house is already packed." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, trying to smile as if this were some temporary inconvenience, some quirk of circumstance that would soon be forgotten. But as they opened the door to the garage and motioned me inside, their eyes avoided mine, their smiles strained and empty, and I knew. The lie had been spoken with such ease it was almost convincing. "It's warmer than it looks," they assured me, but the cold air smelled of exclusion, of dismissal, and I was left shivering in the shadow of their celebration. For hours, I sat in that garage, wrapped in a thin blanket that barely stopped the chill, listening to the muffled joy behind the walls, the clinking of glasses, the rustle of wrapping paper, and the murmur of voices that no longer belonged to me. I thought about calling out, about pounding on the door, but I had learned over the years that my voice was easy to silence, my presence easy to overlook. The cold was a physical weight, but the weight of betrayal settled even deeper. I remembered the years of devotion I had poured into this family, the holidays planned and perfected, the birthdays celebrated with care, the nights spent soothing tears and mending broken hearts. I remembered how my hands had shaped their childhoods with love and patience, and how now, in this moment, those hands were useless, frozen by the cold and the shock of abandonment. As the afternoon slipped into evening, I summoned the courage to knock softly on the door, to ask if I might be allowed in for just a moment, a breath of warmth, a touch of kindness. But no one answered. The silence was louder than any word. It was then that the reality crystallized. They had made a choice. Not to forget me, not to overlook me by accident, but to push me aside as if I were a problem to be contained rather than a person to be loved. I thought about the children who barely glanced my way, about the smiles that didn't reach the eyes, about the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered the room. I thought about the times I had been told to stay put, to not make a fuss, to just be patient. And now, in this garage, with the winter creeping into my bones and the laughter of the family ringing faintly behind locked doors, I understood that patience had run out. They had turned their backs on me not out of cruelty alone, but out of something more profound, a desire to erase me, to make me invisible, so that I might no longer interfere with the life they had built without me. That day, I was not just shut out of the house. I was shut out of the family story, written out of the pages where once I had been the main character. The lock turning in the door was the sound of my place being taken, my role erased, my worth questioned. Yet even as the cold threatened to numb my spirit, something inside me refused to surrender. The betrayal was a wound, deep and raw, but it also ignited a spark of defiance. I would not be forgotten. I would not be silent. And though the door was locked, the fire within me was unlocked, ready to burn through the cold and the darkness that had settled over my Christmas. That night, as I sat alone in the garage, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would not wait for them to remember me. I would find my own way back to warmth, to light, to life. And if they thought locking me away was the end of my story, they were wrong. It was only the beginning. After that long, cold Christmas trapped in the garage, the days that followed did not bring the warmth I had hoped for. Instead, they unfolded like a slow erosion, the subtle ways in which I was pushed further and further away, becoming harder to ignore with each passing moment. The silence at the family gatherings grew louder, and the spaces where I once belonged shrank until there was almost nothing left for me but a few cold corners and empty chairs. I found myself sitting at the edges of conversations, my words met with polite nods or hurried changes of subject, as if my presence was an obligation that everyone bore with quiet resignation. The phone, once a lifeline to those I loved, became a source of disappointment, ringing less and less until it fell silent for hours on end. When it did ring, it was a sharp reminder of my growing invisibility, calls to check in that felt more like interrogations, reminders of duties unmet, apologies that never quite reached the heart. My son's voice on the other end was clipped and distracted, burdened with the stress of his own life, while my daughter-in-law's messages carried the subtle undertone of impatience, as if I were an errand to be run rather than a mother to be cared for. At home, the quiet settled around me like a second skin. The rooms that had once echoed with laughter and memories now felt like a museum, filled with relics of a life I was no longer part of. I found myself tracing my fingers over photographs of birthdays long past, reading the dates and names as if trying to anchor myself to a time when I still mattered. The holiday decorations remained packed away, the ornaments stashed in boxes that I no longer dared to open for fear of the memories they might unleash. The days blended into each other. Wake, eat, watch the clock, wait. I began to understand that this slow withdrawal was as cruel as any sudden rejection. It was a systematic shrinking of my world, a quiet diminishment designed to remind me that my place was no longer at the center of the family story. Even simple routines became battlegrounds of invisibility. When I cooked, my dishes were met with polite thank yous that never blossomed into invitations to sit and share a meal. When I asked about plans, the answers were vague or distracted, as if I were a guest too far removed to truly belong. Invitations to gatherings came with caveats, requests that I not stay too late, that I not make too much noise, that I remember my place. I realized they were not asking me to be part of their lives. They were tolerating me as a courtesy, a relic of a past they wished to keep at arm's length. The loneliness was a heavy cloak, but what stung the most was the gradual erasure of my agency. Decisions about family events, holidays, even the care of my own health were made without me, as if my voice had been quietly silenced. I became accustomed to the feeling of being overlooked in the room, the sensation of my opinions fading into background noise. Yet, despite this creeping isolation, a small part of me refused to vanish. I started keeping a journal, writing late into the nights when the house was still and the weight of invisibility pressed hardest against my chest. I wrote about the memories that gave me strength, about the love I still carried even when it was unreturned. I wrote about the dreams I still dared to hold, dreams of belonging and dignity, of respect and recognition. And slowly, a new resolve took root. I knew I could not remain a ghost in my own family's life. I began making plans, small, quiet steps toward reclaiming a life that felt more mine. I researched local community centers and senior groups, places where I might find connection outside the suffocating silence at home. I looked into part-time jobs, thinking of how I might use the skills I had long forgotten were mine. I considered moving, though the thought was bittersweet, tangled with memories of a house filled with love and loss. But most importantly, I began to understand that my worth was not tied to their acceptance or neglect. It was a truth I had buried beneath decades of duty and sacrifice, but now it emerged like a flame, steady and bright. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the snow fall softly outside, I took out my savings. A small nest egg I had kept hidden from them all these years. With trembling hands, I made a decision to buy myself a ticket. Not back to their house, but to a place where I could find peace, where I could rebuild the pieces of myself they had tried to break. It was a leap into the unknown, a quiet act of rebellion against the slow, cold exclusion they had inflicted. I would not wait for their permission or their apology. I would go. I would begin again. The first day of that journey was filled with a strange mixture of fear and hope. I packed only what I needed: a few clothes, some medications, a worn photo album, and a letter I had written, but never sent. At the airport, I kept my head down, avoiding the stares and whispers of strangers. When I boarded the plane, I felt the weight of all those unspoken words lift slightly from my shoulders. As the city lights faded beneath the wings, I realized that I was not just flying away from the family that had left me behind. I was flying toward myself. This act of leaving was not an escape, but a reclaiming. I was not running from my past, but stepping into a future that I could shape on my own terms. The days that followed were quiet, but filled with a new kind of life. I found a small room to rent in a neighborhood I barely remembered, but was eager to explore. I took up a job at a local cafe, where the early mornings and the steady rhythm of work reminded me of the woman I used to be. The first paycheck was small, but it was mine. I bought myself a warm coat, something sturdy and practical, a symbol of the protection I was learning to give myself. In the evenings, I walked through unfamiliar streets, breathing in the crisp air and feeling the weight of loneliness ease with each step. Slowly, the silence inside me began to fill with something new, not the noise of a family's neglect, but the quiet music of independence, of a life reclaimed. And though the ache of being left behind did not fully fade, it softened, replaced by the growing certainty that I was not alone, that I was still here, still standing, and still worthy of love, even if I had to find it on my own. The moment I stepped into Joyce's house, I felt the weight of years lift slightly from my shoulders, though the air was thick with unfamiliar scents, and the creak of floorboards that spoke of lives lived quietly, but fully. Joyce was a woman who didn't fuss over appearances. Her lavender-scented kitchen was cluttered with well-used pots and pans, the kind of place where real meals were made without recipe cards or measured portions. There was no room for pretense here, no polished smiles or careful silences, just the honest clutter of a life lived on her own terms. When she showed me the small room upstairs, with its chipped paint and faded wallpaper, I saw not a prison, but a sanctuary. The window was wide and let in a soft afternoon light that spilled across the floor like a quiet blessing. For the first time in a long while, I felt something like possibility. Joyce didn't ask me where I had been or why I had come. She simply offered me a place to stay, a small, steady kindness that felt like a lifeline. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that was unfamiliar, yet deeply comforting. Mornings were spent learning the flow of the neighborhood, afternoons working at the cafe where I washed dishes and poured coffee, evenings sharing simple meals with Joyce, who tolerated me with a gruff kindness that needed no explanation. My hands remembered the weight of plates and the warmth of mugs, the careful dance of service and conversation. With each shift, I felt myself rebuilding not just a routine, but a sense of self that had been eroded by years of neglect and silence. I bought myself a coat, a sturdy navy wool with deep pockets, something practical and warm that fit me like a promise. When I first put it on, I caught my reflection in the shop window and barely recognized the woman looking back. Strong, steady, someone who had survived the cold and was learning to carry her own weight again. The coat was more than fabric and thread. It was an act of reclaiming, a statement that I was here, I belonged, and I was no longer waiting for permission to take up space. The first paycheck I earned felt like a small victory, crisp and real in my hand. I folded the bills carefully and slipped them into my purse, feeling the weight of money earned by my own hands, free from obligation or apology. I began to think of this life as mine, not borrowed or tolerated, but chosen and built slowly from the ground up. Joyce and I shared quiet evenings filled with the hum of the old heater and the occasional laughter of the cat curled at our feet. We cooked simple meals and watched muted television shows, the kind that didn't demand attention, but filled the silence with companionship. There was no pressure to explain, no need to justify my absence from the family I had left behind. Instead, there was space, a strange new kind of freedom to be just myself, without apology or expectation. Letters arrived from my grandson, Kieran, the only thread left to the life I had known. His words were tentative but warm, full of hope and apology, a bridge across the silence that separated us. I read his letters carefully, letting his voice remind me that I was still loved, still needed, even if that love had been buried under years of pain. When Lisa came to the cafe, I did not run. I did not hide. We sat across from each other with a distance that was both physical and emotional, trading words that were heavy with history and regret. She spoke of panic and mistakes, of children who missed their grandmother, but her eyes betrayed the truth, that the control she sought to hold had slipped through her fingers, and with it, the family she thought she could shape. I told her what I needed her to hear, that I was no longer the shadow she feared, no longer the silent presence she could manage or ignore. I was my own woman, standing firmly in a life I had chosen. That day marked a turning point, not because of reconciliation, but because of clarity. I saw clearly what I had lost, what I had gained, and what I was still willing to fight for. It was not the family I had dreamed of, but it was the life I needed, one where I could be seen, heard, and respected. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like mine to walk. The past has a way of creeping back in when you least expect it, like the chill that sneaks under your door on an early spring night, persistent and unwelcome. Just as I had begun to settle into my new life, the rhythm of work, the quiet comfort of Joyce's home, the gentle kindness of strangers, the weight of what I had left behind began to press down on me once more. It started with a letter, slipped quietly through the mail slot, and left on the kitchen table without fanfare. The handwriting was familiar, too familiar, looping and precise in the way that only a family member's script can be. It was from Kieran, my grandson, the one bright thread of connection I had clung to during the long, cold days of exile. His words were cautious, filled with worry and hope, asking where I was, if I was safe, and if I might consider coming home. Reading his letter stirred a complex mix of emotions in me: warmth and sadness, love and hesitation. He was the only one who had reached out without judgment, the only one who had remembered me without strings attached. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my drawer, unsure if I was ready to respond. Days later, the fragile peace I had built was disrupted again, this time by a knock at the door. Lisa. She appeared at the cafe where I worked, standing stiff and unsure by the pastry display, her polished coat drenched from the drizzle outside. Her presence was a shock, a ripple in the calm waters I had worked so hard to create. We spoke quietly in the back booth, the noise of the cafe fading into the background as we navigated the minefield of past grievances and unspoken truths. She told me of panic and regret, of children confused and frightened by my absence, and of the efforts to find me, to bring me back. But beneath her words, I sensed the unspoken demand, the expectation that I would return, that I would fall back into the role they had cast me in for so many years. I listened without anger, only a quiet resolve. I told her I was no longer the shadow they could control or ignore, that I was a woman reclaiming her life on her own terms. Lisa left without finishing her coffee, her face a mixture of frustration and something like understanding. Not long after, a lawyer arrived, representing Adam and Lisa, wielding words like weapons dressed in concern. He spoke of assets and well-being, of safe environments and next steps, his tone clinical and cold. I folded my apron, placed it on the counter, and told him simply that I was not a pet to be managed or a problem to be solved, that any further attempts to control me would be met with resistance. The weight of their concern felt less like care and more like a cage closing around me. I was tired of being defined by what I had given, by the sacrifices I had made, and by the silence they imposed. But even as they pushed, I found unexpected allies, strangers who became friends, the barista who saved me a cinnamon roll, the regular at the cafe who shared stories of his own losses and triumphs. Arthur, a widower with kind eyes and a quiet strength, became a steady presence in my days, a reminder that life could still hold kindness and connection. Together, we shared moments of laughter and understanding, building a fragile bridge over the chasm left by family fractures. Then came the newspaper article, a public display of concern that felt more like a spectacle. The headline branded me as missing, the story painting me as vulnerable and lost, a woman who had abandoned her family rather than chosen herself. I laughed bitterly at their portrayal, the image of frailty they insisted on imposing. It was a performance for an audience that had never truly seen me, and I held on to the clipping not out of pride, but as proof of their inability to control the narrative. At the cafe, Heather handed me an extra shift without asking. Her quiet gesture, a small act of faith in a woman who had shown up when others hadn't. Yet, despite the new connections and the small victories, the past was never far behind. Letters arrived, calls went unanswered, and the shadow of old expectations lingered like a fog. But I was no longer willing to be caught in that mist. I wrote letters of my own, to the lawyer, to Lisa, to Kieran. Words carefully chosen to set boundaries and reclaim my voice. I refused to be drawn back into the role of the dutiful mother and grandmother, insisting instead on the dignity I had fought so hard to regain. The legal threats came and went, but I stood firm, surrounded by the new life I had built piece by piece. One afternoon, as I wiped down the counter after a busy shift, I caught sight of Lisa again through the window, standing outside, her coat too fine for the drizzle, her expression unreadable. She didn't come in. She didn't say a word, but her presence was a reminder that the past was still watching, still waiting. That night, I sat with Joyce on the porch, wrapped in blankets and the fading light, sharing silence that spoke louder than words. She didn't ask what I planned to do. She simply passed me the wine mug and said, "You still hiding or healing?" I smiled, knowing it was both. The tension between what was lost and what was gained stretched across every day. But I refused to let it define me. When Arthur came by the cafe, now using a cane, we sat together in quiet understanding. He asked if I ever thought about going back to Wilmington, to the life I had left behind. I shook my head. The answer was simple. No, not once. This was my home now, however fragile and uncertain it might be. The battle for my independence was ongoing, the struggle to be seen and respected far from over. But with every letter I wrote, every shift I worked, every quiet moment spent rebuilding myself, I grew stronger. The past might try to pull me back, but I was moving forward, step by step, toward a life I could call my own. The coldness of exclusion had ignited a fire of resilience, and I was determined to let it burn until it warmed not just my own heart, but the broken pieces left behind. I was no longer waiting for permission to live. I was living, and nothing, not even the weight of betrayal, would take that from me. The day I sent that letter was the day everything changed, though at the time it felt like an ending rather than a beginning. I had sat at the kitchen table for hours, pen in hand, wrestling with words that carried the weight of decades, words that would sever ties, draw lines, and finally claim the dignity that had been stripped away piece by piece. The envelope was thick with resolve, my signature steady despite the tremble in my heart. I addressed it simply to Derek Sorensen, the lawyer, the emissary of a family that still wanted to control me from afar. I told him in no uncertain terms that I was of sound mind, living in a safe environment of my choosing, and that any further contact under the guise of concern would be considered harassment. I had retained local legal counsel, and I was prepared to defend my right to live on my own terms. That letter was not a threat. It was a declaration. A line drawn in the snow that no one could erase. Sending it felt like throwing a stone into a still pond, the ripples of which I knew would spread far and wide. But at last, I was done hiding behind polite smiles and quiet suffering. I was done waiting for apologies that would never come or for permission to reclaim my life. Shortly after, I wrote another letter, this one addressed to Lisa. It was brief, but every word carried the weight of hard-earned clarity. "I know what you did," I wrote. "I know what you didn't say. I'm not angry. I'm not coming back. Take care of your own life now." Those words were not meant to wound, but to free both of us from the chains of a fractured past. I sent it with a bird stamp, a symbol of flight and freedom, a silent message that I was no longer theirs to control. The weeks that followed were filled with a strange mix of silence and tension. Lisa came to the cafe, her presence tentative, as if she was trying to find a way back into a world she had helped fracture. We sat across from each other, the space between us heavy with everything unsaid. She admitted to panicking, to fearing the loss of control, and to struggling with the children's confusion. I listened, not with forgiveness, but with understanding. She wasn't the enemy. She was a woman trapped in her own fears and expectations. When she left, I felt a quiet closure settle over me, not because we had healed, but because I had finally spoken my truth. Around this time, the lawyer returned, more insistent and less patient. He spoke of assets, of well-being, of family responsibilities. But I stood firm, repeating the boundaries I had drawn. I was not a case to be managed or a problem to be solved. I was a woman reclaiming her life, and no legal threat could change that. Arthur, my steadfast companion in this new chapter, stood by me through it all. His quiet strength and gentle humor were a balm to my weary soul. We shared tea instead of coffee sometimes, savoring moments of calm amid the storm. He never asked prying questions, only offered a steady presence that reminded me I was not alone. The community I had found, fragile and imperfect, became my refuge. The cafe where I worked grew into a place of belonging, where my apron and steady hands were valued and needed. Heather, the young woman who managed the busy mornings, offered me extra shifts without hesitation, her trust a small but powerful gift. The newspaper article that once painted me as a vulnerable missing person became a badge of survival. I kept the clipping not out of bitterness, but as proof that I had risen above their attempts to diminish me. The turning point came one quiet evening when Joyce and I sat wrapped in blankets on the porch, watching the stars emerge through the night sky. She asked me softly if I was still hiding or healing. I told her both. I was healing from the wounds that had run deep, but I was no longer hiding from the world or from myself. That night, I lit a candle and placed it by the window, a small beacon of the life I was choosing. The past would always be a part of me, but it would no longer define me. I had taken back my story, my voice, and my dignity. The journey had been long and painful, but I had reached a place where I could finally breathe freely. The locks that once confined me were now memories, and the door I had closed behind me was not a barrier, but a threshold to a new beginning. I was no longer waiting for anyone's permission to live, to love, or to be seen. I was here, fully and fiercely alive, and that truth was my greatest victory. After all the storms had passed, and the echoes of the past began to soften into distant murmurs, I found myself sitting on the porch of Joyce's house, wrapped in a thick blanket, with the cat curled warmly at my feet. The evening air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and wood smoke, and the sky above stretched wide and clear, dotted with stars that seemed to watch over this new life I was slowly building. It was here, in these quiet moments, that I felt the true weight of what I had reclaimed. Not just a place to stay or a job to fill my days, but a sense of self that had been missing for far too long. The phone, once a source of pain and unanswered calls, lay silent and untouched in the drawer, a small rebellion against the past's demands. I was no longer waiting for a call that might never come, or a message that might only bring more hurt. Instead, I was choosing the moments and the people who mattered, carving out space for the life I wanted to live. The letters from Kieran, my grandson, remained my lifeline to the family I hadn't entirely left behind. When he came to visit, those moments were gentle and unhurried, filled with shared stories and quiet understanding rather than expectations or regrets. We didn't try to fix what had broken. We simply acknowledged what was, and that was enough. His presence was a balm, a reminder that love could endure even through distance and silence. The potluck at the community center was a turning point, a gathering where I was not the outsider but a participant, welcomed for who I was rather than who I had been. Joyce and I brought baked goods, and as I handed out slices of sweet potato cake, I felt the warmth of connection in the smiles and conversations that unfolded around the tables. It was not a grand celebration, but it was real. A quiet acknowledgement that life could be rich and full, even when it took a different shape than I had imagined. In the months that followed, I grew into this new rhythm, the small joys accumulating like gentle waves washing over the rough edges of old wounds. The cafe became a second home, where the hum of morning orders and the clatter of cups offered a comforting backdrop to the steady rebuilding of my confidence and sense of belonging. Heather's casual kindness and Arthur's steady friendship reminded me that community could be found in unexpected places, in moments shared over coffee and quiet laughter. The legal letters and visits from lawyers became less frequent, their threats fading into the background noise of a life no longer controlled by others. I had written my own final letters, clear and firm, and those boundaries were respected, if not always welcomed. The decision to keep my phone off for long stretches was a gift I gave myself, a way to protect the fragile peace I had fought so hard to create. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the snow begin to fall, I found myself writing a letter to no one but me. In it, I told the woman I had been, the one who waited too long for rescue, who carried the weight of others' expectations like a shroud, that she was no longer alone. I wrote about the strength I had found in choosing myself, in saying no to silence and yes to life. I tucked that letter into the drawer alongside old recipe cards and faded photographs, a secret reminder of the journey I had traveled. The road had been long and marked by pain, but it had led me here, to a place of peace and quiet triumph. I was no longer a shadow in someone else's story. I was the author of my own, writing each day with a steady hand and an open heart. If this story finds you at the right moment, know that it is never too late to choose yourself, to step away from the cold and into the warmth of your own life. You do not need permission, and you do not owe anyone an explanation. Be your own sign in the silence, your own voice in the stillness. And when you do, come back and tell me. I will be here, sitting on this porch, ready to listen and to welcome you home. I had thought that by the time winter turned to spring, the past would have loosened its grip entirely, that the sharp edges of what had happened would be worn smooth by the rhythm of new days. But I learned quickly that some seasons linger in the mind no matter what the calendar says. The mornings were lighter now, the air carrying a hint of something green, but I still found myself bracing against a cold that wasn't entirely in the weather. I would wake before the alarm, not because I had anywhere urgent to be, but because the habit of years spent waiting for someone else's needs to define my day had not yet fully left me. I would lie in bed listening to the faint sounds of Joyce moving through the kitchen, the whistle of the kettle, the low hum of the radio tuned to a station that played songs from before either of us had the lines in our faces that we do now. And I would think about how strange it felt to have a life that was mine alone to manage. It was both freeing and frightening. At the cafe, the pace shifted with the season. The heavy coats disappeared, replaced by light jackets and impatient tapping on the counter from customers already thinking ahead to the gardens they would plant or the trips they would take. Arthur still came in at 9:10 sharp, leaning a little heavier on his cane than before, but with that same careful dignity in the way he placed his order, as if coffee were not just a drink, but a daily anchor. Heather, for all her briskness, had begun to treat me with a quiet respect that was more telling than any overt compliment. She no longer hovered to check my work, and sometimes she would leave the register entirely in my care while she handled things in the back. There was a satisfaction in that trust, in knowing that my reliability was noticed, even if it was never spoken aloud. One afternoon, between the lunch crowd and the after-school rush, I sat at the counter with Arthur while he told me about the birds returning to the park now that the weather was softening. I realized I hadn't been there once since I'd moved to Portland. My old life had been a constant negotiation, my time given in pieces, my plans always subject to someone else's needs, and it had never occurred to me to go anywhere just because I wanted to. So the next morning, I walked to the park after my shift, carrying a small bag of breadcrumbs in my coat pocket. The air was damp, but not cold, and the paths were still wet from a light rain the night before. When I reached the pond, there were ducks gliding lazily across the water and a few gulls circling overhead, their cries sharp against the stillness. I scattered the crumbs and watched as the ducks paddled over, their movements unhurried, as if they trusted there would be enough. Standing there, I thought about how little I had allowed myself to linger in any one place during those final years with the family. Everything had been about efficiency, about staying out of the way, about being useful without being seen. I realized I had been living as if my presence needed constant justification. Now, I let myself stay until the bag was empty, until the wind picked up just enough to ruffle the water and send a chill through my sleeves. It felt like a small act of rebellion, to stand still, to be in no hurry, to let the world happen around me without rushing to meet it. Kieran called a few days later, his voice warm and a little hesitant. He told me he had enrolled in a writing course at the community college, and that he was working on a story about a woman who leaves but doesn't disappear. I didn't have to ask who she was based on. We talked for nearly an hour, drifting from small updates about his life to quiet pauses where nothing needed to be said. At the end, he asked if he could send me a draft when it was done. I told him I'd like that very much. After we hung up, I sat for a long time with the phone in my hand, thinking about how, in the end, the truest connections are the ones that survive without constant tending, that grow in the quiet as much as in the closeness. Joyce noticed my lighter mood in the days after that call. She didn't say anything directly. She's not the type. But one night, she made a stew rich with herbs and insisted I take the first bowl. It was her way of marking something without turning it into a conversation. Living with Joyce had taught me the value of shared silence, of gestures that meant more than words, of knowing when to leave space for someone to breathe. We didn't pry into each other's histories, but over time, pieces slipped out. Stories told while peeling potatoes, memories that surfaced when an old song came on the radio. I began keeping a small notebook again, something I hadn't done in years. At first, I only wrote down simple things. What the weather was like, what we had for dinner, a line from a conversation I overheard at the cafe. But soon, the pages began to fill with more. Thoughts I hadn't voiced, memories that had started to soften around the edges, moments from my new life that I didn't want to lose to time. I wrote about the way the sun slanted through the kitchen window in late afternoon, about the sound of Arthur's laugh when I teased him about his predictable order, about the satisfaction of finding a second-hand scarf that matched my coat perfectly. These were small things, but they anchored me in the present. The more I wrote, the more I realized that I was no longer documenting absence. My old journals had been full of longing, of what was missing, of the ways I had been overlooked or erased. This one was different. It was not about proving my existence, but about savoring it. I didn't know if anyone would ever read these pages, but that wasn't the point. They were a record for me, a quiet proof that I had built something after everything else had fallen away. One Saturday, I went back to the park, this time with Arthur. He brought a small folding stool, and we sat near the pond watching the ducks. He told me about his late wife's habit of naming them, even though she knew they weren't the same birds year to year. It wasn't about who they really were, he said. It was about giving them a place in the story. I understood that in a way I couldn't have months earlier. We all want to belong somewhere, even if it's just in someone's quiet naming. The next morning, I woke to find a small envelope propped against my coffee mug on the kitchen counter. Joyce had left before me, off to run errands, but inside the envelope was a postcard with a photograph of a lighthouse and a single sentence in her blocky handwriting. "Don't forget you're your own light." I stood there, holding it for a long moment, feeling the truth of it settle into me. I wasn't waiting for someone else to keep me lit anymore. I could stand in the wind and the dark and still shine. By the time summer came, I realized I had stopped counting the weeks since I left Wilmington. The dates that once loomed, holidays, birthdays, anniversaries, no longer dictated the shape of my days. I remembered them, yes, but they didn't pull me backward the way they once had. The house in Wilmington, with its polished rooms and carefully curated silences, felt like something from another lifetime. In its place was this life, imperfect and sometimes lonely, but mine in a way that nothing before had ever been. Sometimes I think about writing to Adam, not to explain or reopen the past, but to say that I am well, that I am not lost, that I have found something better than what I left. But then I think of the silence I've worked so hard to protect, and I leave the thought where it is. Some doors, once closed, don't need reopening. I know now that the measure of a life isn't in how many people show up for you when things are easy, but in how you carry yourself when no one is looking. I carried myself out of the garage that Christmas and into the unknown, and each day since has been a step toward something I didn't even know I was allowed to want. And maybe that's the point. Not that I found a perfect ending, but that I found a way to keep going, to keep choosing, to keep my own light steady, no matter who's watching. The heat of summer settled over the city in a way that made even the mornings feel heavy, but I found comfort in the steady hum of the cafe's fans and the slow rhythm of customers moving in and out. By now, I knew most of them by name, could predict who would order what without them saying a word, and I had become part of that quiet network of people who notice each other without fanfare. It was a strange kind of belonging, one built on small nods, shared weather complaints, and the exchange of coffee cups between hands. Arthur had started bringing in cut flowers from his garden, leaving them in a small vase on the counter. He never announced it, but people noticed. One morning, a woman leaned in to tell me that it was the first time in months she had seen fresh blooms anywhere in her day. And I caught Arthur watching from his usual seat, pretending to read the newspaper, but clearly listening. It struck me then that we were both building something. Not big, not loud, but steady. On my days off, I began walking farther, exploring streets I hadn't seen before. I found a small, used bookstore tucked between a laundromat and a locksmith, its windows dusty but full of promise. Inside, the air smelled of paper and time, and the man behind the counter greeted me as though we had been expecting each other. I spent an hour there, tracing my fingers along spines, pulling out volumes at random, sometimes reading a single sentence before sliding them back into place. I left with a second-hand copy of a book I had once loved in my 20s, its pages yellowed but intact, as if it had been waiting for me to come back to it. Reading in the evenings became a habit. Joyce would sometimes join me, each of us lost in our own pages, the silence between us comfortable. I found myself underlining passages, not for their wisdom, but for how they reminded me of moments in my own life. In a way, I was mapping my story into the margins of someone else's, stitching my voice into a larger tapestry. One night, a storm rolled in unexpectedly. The rain hit the roof hard, and the wind rattled the porch chairs against the railing. Joyce and I sat by the window watching the trees sway, the air thick with the smell of wet earth. She mentioned offhand that the power might go out, and for a moment I was thrown back to winters in Wilmington, the sound of a house settling in dark, the way the silence used to feel like a weight pressing in on me. But then I realized something had shifted. This silence didn't feel the same. It wasn't the silence of being excluded, it was the silence of being safe. The lights flickered once and then steadied. But even if they had gone out, I knew we would have been fine. We had candles in the cupboard, blankets piled high in the living room, and between us, a kind of trust that didn't need to be spoken aloud. The storm passed by midnight, and when I stepped outside the next morning, the air was fresh and sharp, the sidewalks littered with petals and leaves. It felt like a reset, as if the world had shaken off something it no longer needed. That day at the cafe, Kieran walked in without warning. He looked older than the last time I had seen him, taller, his shoulders broader, but his eyes were the same. Bright, searching, holding back more than they said. We didn't rush into conversation. Instead, I poured him a cup of coffee and sat across from him in the booth near the window. He told me he had finished his story and that he had brought a copy for me. I didn't open it right away. We talked about his classes, about the way the city felt different in the summer, about nothing and everything. When he left, he hugged me for longer than I expected, and in that moment I felt something loosen in me. Not forgiveness, exactly, but the acknowledgement that love could take new shapes. I stood at the window and watched him walk away, the weight of the book in my hand both grounding and light. That night, I read it in one sitting, pausing only to let certain sentences sink in. He hadn't written me exactly as I was, but he had seen enough of me to get it right where it mattered. I closed the book and left it on the kitchen table for Joyce to find in the morning. As I climbed into bed, I realized I wasn't measuring my life anymore by what I had lost, but by what I was quietly building. The past would always be there, but it no longer owned me. I was living in a story that was still being written, and for the first time in years, I was eager to see what the next page would hold.